Okay, so my name is Alicia, and today I am going to be showing you my favorite tools. So I have quite a few tools that are my go-tos, my favorites, things that I absolutely love to work with when I am doing embroidery or beadwork. So I've tailored this video to really show you the tools that I use for that specific style of work. No brand is necessarily better than another. This is just what I prefer to use for my work. And if you follow my work and you love my work and you want to know more about the type of tools that I use, or if you're just entering as a beginner into making any kind of embroidery or beadwork, this is kind of a great starting point for you to, and a really exciting starting point for you, because some of the funnest part of making things is going out and choosing your supplies. So I'm here to just talk about the tools that I use when I'm embroidering, the tools that I love to use when I'm doing beadwork, and I'm going to jump right into that. So I'll start at the very basic level. What are the essentials that you need when you're doing embroidery? The first thing that you absolutely need are the materials that you're going to embroider on, and I'm not going to get into those today because that is so vast and wide. But traditionally, if you're just starting out on doing embroidery, you could use any kind of fabric scraps that you feel comfortable with using and testing and experimenting with. Cotton is obviously a really great one because it's thinner, easy to push your needle through, and easy to push over a frame. But you could also branch out and use things like felt or leather or any kind of material. So basic. You need snips. Because when you're working with thread, you are eventually going to have to cut thread. Now, these are my favorite snips for sewing. And when I look at them and you look at them, they kind of look like a really terrifying weapon. A word of advice, they like to go missing really quickly. So sometimes I'll tie a little string around them that I'll tape to my sewing machine, or I'll attach them to kind of like a lanyard so that I can wear them around my neck. If you are going to wear them around your neck, pro tip, they will cut holes into your shirt if you're wearing a shirt. So just make sure that when you are wearing them, that you're not wearing a shirt that you really love, because these tips are so sharp. And they are really great for just cutting things nice and close to your work. They're very flat. So that's me turning them sideways here. They're so flat, so they can get really close and down to your work and just snip any little loose threads off of it. So I love these snips. Any brand of these are great. These are just maybe $1 at my local sewing supply store, so they're really great. The other type of snips that I like to use are a pair of snips that would have a long, skinny tip to their blade. Now, the long skinny tip to the blade, and what that really does here is allow you to get into the more finicky areas of work where you might need to get in between a couple beads or in between some stitches and really catch a loop or a thread that's caught somewhere. You can really use these snips to fish out those little ends and snip them. So you want like a nice sharp pair that are nice and skinny, and I'll link a few of my favorite brands for these. These are just a pair that I have in my studio, but I've got a few trusted brands that I think are really great that make these really great, nice, long-tipped embroidery snips. So snips, definitely a necessity. Next thing that you're probably going to use a lot of are needles, and I will talk about my favorite thing to store needles. This is a magnet dish. Now, my magnet dish has a crack in it because I dropped it, so I'll just hide that under my hand. But it is a plastic covered dish. It looks almost like a puck, and they come in different sizes, they come in different styles, but the best part of them is that I can drop something and it just flies right back to this magnet bowl. So when I'm working with a lot of pins or a lot of needles and I'm trying to keep them all organized, I like to keep them on my magnet. So next tool after my magnet dish, the needles. So needles are vast and various, and I'll link my favorite kind in this video as well. But one of my favorite types of needles, and I don't know how well this is going to show up on my video here, so let's see if I can get it nice and clean. Hard to say. So I don't know if you can tell in my video, but the tip of this needle is gold. The rest of the needle is silver. Now, what a gold tip needle is just a higher quality brand of needle that I've been using from Clover. Gold-headed needles, to me, are just good in the sense that they're well made. They don't break. I've never had one rust on me. They just seem to have a better strength. They're made by Clover. Often you can find them at Fabricland. I'm pretty sure Joann's might carry them in the US, but I can link to Clover so you can see kind of what I'm talking about here. But they're my favorite brand of needles, and I use them for embroidery. And there's a few different brands out there in terms of needles, but this is the one that I really like to use when I'm using embroidery floss to do any kind of sewing, or even just hand sewing of any sort. I really trust the Clover brand, and I've got a few of their tools as well. So that's one of my favorite needles. Now, the other needle that you might need, and this is if you're going into things like beadwork, are beading needles. Now, they come in a nice little paper package, or at least these ones do, from John James here. Now, John James is a beading needle brand. These are a size 12, 10 of them come in a pack. But the beauty of a beading needle, and I'll take one out to show you, is its length and its size. So pop one of those out. They like to all come out at once, so I'm trying not to drop them. This is a beading needle. Whew. You can't really tell, but it is super long. It's about as long as my finger. It's super, super thin. That's why it's really hard to see and show you in this video. But it's really long, it's really thin, and it's so great at picking up beads. It's very bendy, and that can be really nice too. It can curve a little bit, so you can kind of push it flat against your surface or whatever you're picking your beads up off of. I like to use a cup or a plate. Sometimes I'll use a fancy Chinaware dish that would sit under a vintage teacup. I also really like using a velvet mat for picking beads up from, so I might do a tutorial later on how to make yourself a bead mat. They're always fun to make, and they're a great way to use up your scraps. But these fun, long, thin needles can pick up so many beads at once, and they can hold all your beads until you string them onto another string if you're doing work like tambour work, or if you're doing any kind of tacking work with beads on a string. But you could also just use it to pick up beads and sew them onto your fabric. So they're really thin, they're really sharp, they hurt a lot when you poke them into your hands or your fingers, so just be careful of that because they are so thin, but they're very flexible and they're really useful. So mine are from John James, and they come 10 to a pack. These are size 12. The higher the number in hand sewing needles, the thinner it is. So I don't know how often that's said. It's a little bit different than if you're working with a sewing machine. Often a bigger gauge of needle or a larger number would indicate a thicker size. In hand sewing needles, it goes the opposite way. So a size 12 is very thin, and a size 10 or a 9 is going to be thicker. So these are a size 12, real thin, great to go through little seed beads and bugle beads. So I really like these, and I got these from John Bead, which is a store in Toronto. So you could check out John Bead for those, or any beading store might have them. They're really great. I also have a favorite pair of scissors. So you don't want to be using your embroidery snips for anything other than thread. When you use embroidery snips or sewing snips to clip your threads, the area of the blade that gets worn down is specifically where you are cutting your thread. When you are using fabric shears, you want an even wear down on the blade. If you're just cutting thread with it, you're wearing down little spots in the blade over time, and that can end up causing burrs in your snips, and you'll have to get them sharpened more often than not. So these are a pair of Dragonfly shears. These are one of the smaller pairs because my hands are a bit smaller, that I started investing in when I was going to art school and I was taking courses in textiles and surface design. I just wanted a really good pair, a trusty pair of fabric scissors. The main point that you want to remember is that every pair of scissors should only have one material, one, that it cuts through. And so these are my fabric scissors, these are my thread snips. Never the two cross. Now, sometimes if you're in a pinch and you just got to cut something, go for it. But when you start investing in higher quality tools where the price tag is a little bit higher and the maintenance of those objects becomes more imperative to maintain their quality, then you start to really separate what tool is used for what. So these scissors never cut paper, they never cut leather, they only cut fabric, and they're quite sharp. They're really great. I get them sharpened about once a year, so not very often, but I absolutely love them and I swear by them. Some other scissor brands that people swear by are Ginger. Singer makes some scissors as well, and I'll post some links to some other great scissor brands as well and where you can find them. The other thing that you will need when you are embroidering is thread, or as we like to call it in embroidery, floss. So you've probably seen these at your local craft store, whether it's a fabric store, Walmart, anywhere where you buy craft supplies. You will generally see this type of embroidery floss in this exact packaging. Now, it's not to say that all brands are equal. So I really love DMC. DMC brand is what I swear by in terms of embroidery floss. It's just something about the twist and the quality of the threads that they are using and the cotton. They do have a wide array of colors, and I generally find my DMC thread at either Michael's, Walmart, or fabric and craft stores like Joann's and Fabricland. An important thing to remember when you're buying your embroidery floss: look for DMC brand, or of course any other brand that you trust. But what you really want to make sure you do is keep track of the number. At the bottom of your embroidery thread, especially if it's DMC brand, is you're going to have a number down here, or a number for the color. And what you want to do is keep track of what that color is. When you are doing a project, sometimes and inevitably, you will run out of things that you're using, especially things like embroidery floss. When you go back to the store, you want to make sure you get the same color. So keeping track of this number, make sure that you know what color you're looking for when you go to the store, and you're not just kind of holding up threads and hoping to find one that's similar. Keeping track of the number is really good. It's also great if you're working from a pattern for either cross stitch or an embroidery pattern. Often they will give you the number of the DMC thread that's being used so that you know, or just the embroidery thread in general and what brand, so that you know what to go out and purchase to achieve the exact same colors. And some of the colors are so close to each other, it's really hard to tell them apart until you have a whole bunch of embroidery done, and then you can really see the difference between two very similar shades. Okay. So the Beadalon Spin-N-Bead Junior, this is what a bead spinner is. Now, when you get one, they are great for spinning beads that come in either bags loose or in tubes that are loose. And depending on what type of embroidery or beading you're doing, you might want to have those beads on a strand. And that would generally be used more for tambour or Lunaville type broderie. But if you are someone who likes to keep all your beads organized in strands, it's a great tool to have. It comes with a couple things. It comes with a curved needle that helps pick up all of the beads as you spin them. And the bead spinner itself is actually two pieces. It has a base and a top, so they fit together. And the Beadalon ones are all made out of wood, which is great. It just has a really nice feel in terms of quality as a product, and they're not overly expensive. The Junior that I got on Amazon was not very expensive in terms of prices for bead spinners. So I do highly recommend them if you're someone who likes to keep your beads organized in strands, but you're finding that a lot of the beads that you're buying come loose. In terms of things that you can use for transferring embroidery on, or your design onto another surface, I have a series of things. So one of the things that I really like to use is tracing paper. So this is an example of a design that I drew. This one is a dagger with some they, them pronouns. Really ties into my work about being queer and genderqueer themes. Now, this is just your standard tracing paper. You can use baking parchment paper if you don't have access to rolls of tracing paper. I like to buy mine from Curry's Art Supplies in Toronto or in Canada in general, but you can also find tracing paper by the roll at some fabric stores and some drafting supply stores. But ideally you want to look at art supply stores when you're looking for your tracing paper because there's so many different kinds. I steer clear of vellum. Vellum for me is a little bit too slick in that the pencil, when I draw on it, doesn't tend to stick or adhere to the paper as well, and so you get a lot of smudging. So for me, I really like using just your standard parchment type of tracing paper. So I like to also use wax-free tracing paper. Now this is Unique brand. I'll try and flip it around here so you can see the brand. There we go. So this one you can find at your local craft store, possibly Michael's, but definitely Fabricland, possibly also Joann's, and probably also on Amazon. Now, this type of paper comes in a pack of colors. So there's blue, there is also yellow, there is a pink color as well, and white. Now, what this package contains are all these different pieces of paper that are called transfer paper. And with what it means when it says wax free is that the paper itself, the coating on it, does not contain wax. Now, here's a little tidbit of information. If your transfer paper contains wax and you iron your surface, there is a possibility that the wax that is being used, kind of like a crayon, will melt and spread into your fabric. And depending on the type of fabric you're using, that might not make a difference. However, if you're using a nice smooth cotton and you're doing a fine outline and you go to press your work or you go to press your fabric later at some point and you see that kind of oil stain that you would get if you accidentally spilt oil on clothing, it can be pretty unsightly. Okay, so when I am using my transfer paper, the one with the chalk back, and I've chosen a blue one here, the blue on this side is chalk and the backing is just paper. So I like to lay my fabric right side up, or the side that I'm going to be embroidering, onto a flat surface like a table. Then I lay my transfer paper chalk side down on top of it, and then I lay my image on top of that. Then I can just draw my image or trace over it with either a sharp pencil or a pen, something with a nice hard tip. So you don't want to use a felt point marker, but you might want to use a pen or a pencil. I like to just use a sharp pencil. And when I draw it all out on here and lift this up, this will have transferred the blue chalk as an outline of my drawing onto my fabric. So I really swear by chalk paper when it comes especially to dark fabric, because they show up on those dark fabrics. So I do recommend investing in wax-free transfer paper or tracing paper. And then the last thing that I sometimes like to use, and this is more for when you are working with a fabric that isn't cotton or isn't flat and you can't just draw your design onto it, you might want to invest in tissue paper, your favorite local gift wrap. Basically, tissue paper can become how you transfer your image onto a type of fabric that would be a little bit harder to trace on top of. Now that might include something like mesh, especially illusion mesh or tulle if you're doing something like an applique that you want to cut out and sew onto something else, but you're working with a fabric that is see-through or semi-transparent that you can't just draw on top of. So tissue paper is really great for that. You can basically take the tissue paper and lay it on top of your drawing or design, as I've done with this one here. And then I go ahead and trace it out with a pencil and I remove that piece. And so you can kind of see it's nice and faint, but there is a drawing on there of the dagger that I'm going to embroider. And what I do is I pin that to my fabric and then I baste right through that drawing that I've done on my tissue paper and I tear the tissue paper away. And that's kind of the only quick way that I've figured out how to transfer a design that has an outline like this, it's very graphic, onto something like mesh. Last tool that I want to talk about, last but not least, is when you're done your embroidery, what are you going to do with it? So there's a few different options here. Obviously, you might want to cut out that little embroidery that you have and make something like a patch out of it. Some people display their embroideries in their hoops. You can paint them if they're wood, sometimes they're plastic. They come in a lot of different colors, and you can get them at any craft store. They're basically a hoop with a circle inside. But if you want to cut out that embroidery and do something with it, you might sew it directly onto another piece of fabric, or if you're not so into sewing and you want to maybe sell your embroidery as a patch, then you might want to invest in heat and bond. Now, Heat and Bond is a very specific product because it is a brand. Heat and Bond is a brand. Now, Heat and Bond is basically a type of adherable fabric backing. Now, there's a few different kinds out there. This one comes from HA Kid, Heat and Bond brand, Ultra Hold. It basically adds a backing to your work that creates an iron-on surface. So if you've ever bought a patch from any store and it has kind of a plasticky backing and you just put it on to your clothing and you iron it and then it's stuck, that's exactly what Heat and Bond does. So it is a way to add an adherable fabric to the back of your work so that you can iron it onto something else without having to sew. And for people who are buying your work that aren't so maybe into sewing or don't have a lot of experience with sewing or just don't like the look of sewn edges around a patch, this actually works out really well, especially if you're planning to sell your work like that. So those are all my tools. I hope that this was informative and fun. I know that there's a lot of information to unpack here, and that's totally fair. Feel free to skip through this video to the subheadings that explain what each type of thing that I'm talking about is, because they do fall into different categories. Do look at the links in the video to find out where you can buy these items online. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or message me directly. I'd be happy to help, especially if you're looking for a specific product that you can't find, or if you're wondering where to find that product locally. So thank you so much for listening to this great video. Thank you for checking out my Patreon. And if you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll be posting more tutorials soon, especially for how we are going to use all of these exciting tools as we create our embroidery sampler.